Hello from London, I'm Riz Khan. Today we talk with legendary musician and producer Brian Eno about his anti-war activism. Hello and welcome. Roxy Music, David Bowie, Talking Heads, U2, Paul Simon and Coldplay are some of the best-known names in the music industry. And in spite of their diverse sounds and approaches to their art, they share one thing. At some point, one particular iconic musician and producer has been a force in shaping them. But beyond the music, Brian Eno's diverse interests have taken him into the world of generative art, science and futurology. More recently, he's putting his creative drive to use in the political arena, speaking out against the war in Iraq, environmental issues and civil liberties. Now, he's with us today to discuss some of those areas of interest. Brian, good to have you with us.
Hello.
I want to start off by asking you about the way you describe yourself, an evangelist atheist.
Yeah.
So,
well, I suppose that what I see as the biggest problem of our time is fundamentalism of various kinds, whether it's the kind that seems to have possessed the Islamic world in some corners, or the world, the so-called democratic world in some corners. They're forms of fundamentalism which are almost always justified by an appeal to religion. George Bush justifies it that way, just as Osama bin Laden does. So, although I'm not making an equivalence between those two, I am making an equivalence about the kind of arguments that they call on, and those are essentially religious arguments. Those are arguments which say somebody else knows better than we do, and I don't think humans can afford to make that kind of statement any longer. I think we have to start taking responsibility. So this is the value of atheism to me.
I know you're very aware of the consumer culture that seems to dominate our world nowadays, and I wonder in what way that's been driving your sort of philosophy and why you've become so politically active in these areas.
Yes, I think that the West has gone down a road which it might want to start questioning now, which is what I would call market fundamentalism. The idea being that the market was the only way of deciding whether something should be done or whether it had value. And we're starting to see the problems that arise from that point of view. We're starting to see decaying education systems and huge prison populations and teenage pregnancy and so on, because we have become so laissez-faire about any form of social intervention. On the other hand, not at all laissez-faire about intervening in other countries, which seems to me a bad idea.
It's on that note, actually, I wanted to ask you about your views on the word democracy, because that's the excuse or the justification that's given by many countries, particularly the US, when it makes a decision to go into Iraq, for example. I wonder what you see, how you value the word democracy now, the way it's used.
I value the concept of democracy a lot, but first of all, I would say that it isn't one thing. It's a very broad church, democracy. There are lots and lots of different ways of practicing it, as you can see by the difference between, let's say, Sweden and Texas. They would both call themselves democratic, but they share very little in terms of values, I would say. So first of all, before we start exporting democracy, I think we should perhaps reach some agreement by what we mean by it. I'm distressed that in the last 10 years Britain has become a significantly less democratic country, and yet has become much more evangelical about exporting democracy to other countries. So I think we're not currently in a very good position to be foisting this onto other people.
And I know you point out that the lack of involvement people have in the voting process, the lack of attachment they have now to the political democratic process. And I wonder, really, why do you feel that places like Britain have removed themselves so much from the decision making that could alter their political future?
This is a very difficult problem. I think people are quite rightly disillusioned with the political systems that they're part of. They know they don't have much effect on it. I mean, the huge anti-Iraq war march, the biggest march in British history actually, before the war started, had absolutely no impact on government. At least it seems that way, So of course people start to think, what difference can I make? And so they withdraw from the voting process. And this is also because I think people are starting to sense that national governments are not really the seat of power any longer. So many of the serious problems we face really are global problems, and they're not susceptible to the wills of one particular government. You know, they really have to be passed up to a global level. Environmental issues are like that. The problem of terrorism is like that, actually. And many, many other problems. Poverty on the world scale, dirty water, all those things are really problems that we should be solving as an international community. And then on the other hand, a lot of other problems are too local for national governments. They should be devolved down to neighbourhoods almost. So it seems to me that national government is becoming a smaller and smaller slice of total governance. But of course it wants to defend its patch and it wants to continue to seem important.
Interesting point you make about it needs to go up to a higher level, but beyond the United Nations, we really have no other sort of world body that can take responsibility. And of course, the UN is always accused of being manacled by its member nations, and being democratic is how the UN people always defend it. And I wonder if you see any change in the role of an organisation such as the UN to be able to be more effective, to be more powerful in making global decisions.
I think the UN is more effective than people think, actually. And I think it's more effective in the areas that are slightly out of the spotlight. For example, if you ever look at a UN website, you find that it is host to hundreds and hundreds of initiatives that are happening all over the world, which we don't hear much about. They haven't become controversial, and the UN quietly gets on with them. And so I think it does have the makings of an effective organisation, but also I think it protects the idea that there is at least one place where everybody can talk together. Now I think it certainly needs reinforcing, it needs rethinking, it needs expanding. And it needs to inspire enough confidence for national governments to feel that they can pass their problems to the UN level without getting screwed somewhere along the way.
Now tell me about what you're involved with, particularly with Europe, because you've got some pretty high-powered names coming together and trying to find a more effective form of governance, I guess, in Europe. Tell me about that.
This is the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is an organisation that is backed by George Soros, among others. And I hope will be a very effective force in the future. I think one of the things that a lot of people realised is that Europe has, since the last war, has really taken a position which is sort of original in terms of world history. It's a new social position. And essentially that position is we've decided to try to solve problems without going to war about them. So Europe, which looks terribly boring and grey because there's lots of negotiations and compromises and endless meetings and committees, nonetheless, that to me is the sound of peace at the moment. All of that, which seems rather dull and boring, is the sound of people getting on with each other, essentially trying to find an accommodation with each other. You know, war looks much more thrilling because, you know, you go in and mission accomplished 2 months later. You're on the battleship saying mission accomplished. But then you find out that no mission has been accomplished and a lot of other problems have appeared. There's a very interesting quote in Mark Leonard's book, which is a book called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, which is quite idealistic, but he says when America wants to get its way in the world, it threatens to invade. When Europe wants to get its way, it threatens to stop talking to you. And I think that is really that's a very good position, that Europe is saying to people, if you want to work with us, you have to accept some of our standards of behaviour. That's all, you know.
We had an email for you, actually, I'd like to put to you, from Zelina in Hamilton in New Zealand. Zelina writes in saying, the so-called Iraq War is a conflict to rival what was done at Wounded Knee. Brute force and superior firepower against rusty old rifles. Maybe it's time for all governments to listen to Hollywood, musicians and artists who depict a dying world. And I wonder, you know, you're a voice among a lot of politicians. I mean, officially you don't have a political background. How easy is it for you to have your voice, and how effective do you feel you can be?
I think the special position that you have, if you're outside of politics, is that people recognise that you don't have a vested interest or a kind of career path that you're following. You know, I'm not speaking on behalf of a party or of anything, actually, other than I'm speaking in terms of what seems to me to be relatively obvious and susceptible to anyone else's investigation. So I don't have an axe to grind. I've got a life and a career, and I'm quite happy with that. This is a separate observation that I make as a citizen. Of course, I accept that because of my celebrity, whatever it is, I get the microphone handed to me. But since that's true, I decided to do something with the microphone. I mean, I think Zelina's right that the democratic process certainly ought to include a lot of other voices besides those of politicians. And it ought to include a lot of other voices besides those of celebrities as well.
Well, in terms of the phrase that's touted around a lot, clash of civilizations, to what extent do you buy into that idea? There is a clash, particularly as it's positioned between the West and Islam.
I don't buy into the idea at all. I've always disliked it, actually. I think there is a clash of fundamentalists, as I said at the beginning, that there are extreme wings of the whole spectrum of human thought. But you know, I know so many people across that range that I can't be convinced by this simple picture that it amounts to two sort of extreme wings who are fighting each other. Those are outside of the conversation as far as I'm concerned.
There was an interesting book recently written by Naomi Klein, who we had on the show a while back. She's the author of No Logo, which was an iconic book. She wrote, just recently wrote The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capital. A very interesting book, which, after a lot of research and puts a lot of evidence forward for this concept that the governments and big business use natural disasters and man-made events such as war as an ideal opportunity to put forward really extreme views or to change the whole paradigm of whatever they want to. And people are in such shock that they accept it quietly. To what extent do you think that is happening, that people are sitting back quietly because they're in shock with things such as September the 11th or the tsunami, for example, created one big shock?
I think that's an absolutely accurate analysis. I mean, I remember when 9/11 happened, I phoned my wife up. I said, "Have you seen what's happened?" My wife is very cynical in a certain way, and she said 2 minutes after the second plane hit, she said, "America will use this." She said, "This is what they needed to do what they want." And I said, "You're so cynical." She was absolutely right. And you know, I would never subscribe to the conspiracy theories that say it was a setup by Mossad and the CIA or something. I don't believe that for a minute. But what I do think is that there are people who are smart enough to know when they have an opportunity to advance their agenda. And I think that clearly happened after 9/11. Suddenly, all sorts of civil liberties that have taken a very long time to win could be got rid of.
We had another email I'd like to put to you. It came from Canada. And Gil Hughes wrote in saying, "What do the so-called experts have to lay claim to? They are the ones who know more and more about less and less. They have nothing. They have solved nothing. Talk, talk, talk. Pitiful. The mess in our world is only getting worse." Now, I wonder, reading some of the things you've written, some of the interviews you've done also on this subject, I wonder, do you trust governments?
Well, for the reasons I said earlier, it gets more and more difficult to trust them, because I think the territory of their control is diminishing all the time, national governments. So I think that they are now trying to operate in areas that don't naturally belong to them. It's very difficult for any government to do anything significant about global warming on its own. It has to subscribe to global bodies. The Kyoto Protocol was a good example of one that America wouldn't subscribe to, and you know, if they don't subscribe to it, then it's not going to work, really. So I think that what's needed is some way that citizens can really compel their governments to pay attention to those kinds of initiatives. I'm disillusioned and rather pessimistic about the future of national governments. I'm much more interested in the future of NGOs and pressure groups, actually. A friend of mine recently has compiled a glossary of environmental and social pressure groups, and he estimates that there are now over 1 million of them in the world. That's a huge number. 1 million groups of people who've decided to take on an issue and apply pressure, and I think that's sort of the trajectory of the future, really.
Now, it's interesting because you talked about America's approach and Europe's approach to to issues, the invading and not talking to. How do you regard the so-called special relationship that Britain and America has?
I think more and more that we should be paying attention to another relationship that we have, which is much more special as far as I'm concerned, which is the relationship with Europe. Now, had we done that in the lead up to the Iraq War, we probably would not have been in that war. And actually, that war may not have happened, because I think Britain's involvement was the fig leaf that made it look like an international campaign. That was what allowed America to go ahead with a war that essentially becomes more and more clear was a sort of imperialist war, which, by the way, I think they've won. All this stuff about it being a total disaster is not true, actually. I think what they wanted to achieve was to have a large military force in the Middle East, and that's what they've got, and that's what they will have for a very long time. That's why there's no exit strategy, because they don't plan to leave. But I think that could have been avoided if Britain had aligned itself with Europe and European interests rather than with American interests.
How do you think that these sort of dynamics, I mean, people are starting to question, you know, for example, America's role in the Middle East and so on. How do you think these dynamics are affected by, again, another popular word that's used, globalization?
Globalization is terrifying to everyone in many respects because it means a loss of control. You know, we've already seen as Naomi Klein would be the first to point out what the power of global corporations is. They operate outside governments. They are essentially independent financial systems that can move capital around the world in a way that we can't move humans or ideas or anything else around the world. So global capital is now completely free, but nothing else is. So this creates a very difficult and very uncontrollable situation. I feel, I suppose, that this is just one of the many problems of a highly communicative, advanced society that haven't been dealt with. We don't know how to deal with the society that we've landed ourselves with.
I wonder, you know, as we sort of wrap things up, we're running out of time. I just wonder, with the way your sort of political views have been shaped, I've read, came from that sort of progressive art education system of the 1960s. And I wonder to what extent that system where people do question or have that sort of progressive attitude has disappeared. I mean, do you see young people of today being shaped by the things you witnessed, you know, through the education system when you were young?
I think that's a very good question. I think one of the things I most want to address is the issue of education now, because one of the things that's happened in the last 15 years is the concept of accountability. So schools are terrified of not getting so many students through A-levels, and students are terrified of not getting their A-levels as if their whole life is going to come to nothing unless they do. So there's such a pressure on a particular form of performance, which is not very often to do with creative and original thinking. It's to do with exam scoring. And I would really love to start to rethink the education system. I mean, Finland has a very good education system. Here we have in Europe an amazing example of an original education system which we should be looking at.
Well, Brian, there's many more things to talk about. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It was a real pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. And thank you for being with us. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk is up next.